Hello. Welcome to our program. My name is Don Cooney. I'm an associate professor in the School of Social Work here at Western Michigan University. Our program today is entitled Perspectives on a New World Order, Eastern Europe. One of the most exciting things happening in the world over the past year are some of the changes that are taking place. But there are different interpretations and different viewpoints on what these changes are and what these changes mean. Today, we are very fortunate to have with us a gentleman and a scholar who has spent considerable amount of time observing these changes, a man who has been going back and forth to Eastern Europe for the past 17 years. He is Dr. Rudolf Siebert, professor of religion here at Western Michigan University. Welcome, Dr. Siebert. Dr. Siebert, you just came back. In this past year, you have traveled through several countries in Eastern Europe. Perhaps we could start off by you telling us where you went and why you went there.
Yes. I have had contacts with Eastern Europe since 1975, when I was invited by the University of Zagreb to establish a course on the future of religion. And then from 1975 on, every year we met there, an international group of scholars from all over the globe, including last year, April, in spite of all the turmoil. So I saw somehow the whole development arising, because it goes much further back than 1985, perestroika or so. I think the present crisis, or whatever is happening now, has started much earlier, and one could see it through all these years. One could see it coming. So in that sense, it was not so much of a surprise, I think, for all those people who had contact with these countries. So since last August 1990, I then traveled to Poland, and I gave a paper in Wrocław, the former Breslau, German Breslau, and from there I went to East Germany. And then during April and May of this year, I traveled to Hungary, and then from Hungary to Yugoslavia, and then from Yugoslavia through Belgium to East Germany. And I taught a whole semester at the University of Rostock at the Baltic Sea. I taught particularly in the theology department and in the department for applied linguistics. And I gave a course on theology, but also a course on America, because they want to know what is coming, really. So I gave a course on how Americans speak, work, love, and struggle for recognition. And I talked 3 months about this.
Now, that course was in Yugoslavia.
No, this course was in Rostock then. Yes, at the University of Rostock. It's a very old university from the Middle Ages. It is a Hanseatic type of a city, so a very bourgeois type of a city. And they invited me to teach from April to late April to May to end of June.
Mm-hmm. Well, I guess there are so many different things that we need to talk about, and we have some time to talk about them. But I think one of the things that's very much been capturing the headlines right now is what is happening in Yugoslavia. Mm-hmm. And for many people, including myself, it is difficult to understand, because I don't have a historical perspective on the country. Could you tell me what happened, how we got to where we are now? What's going on there in Yugoslavia?
Well, I mean, there is an age-old, of course, antagonism between the Serbian population and the Croatian population. So it is on all levels. They differ on all levels. The Croatian population is Roman Catholic. The Serbian population is Orthodox. The Serbian population has voted to a large extent for socialism. Croatia has voted for nationalism. And so, of course, also Croatia was always inclined toward the West. Serbia is more inclined toward the East. And now, after Tito, and then after the whole communist type of regime somehow weakened, at least, then those old contradictions and old antagonisms just came to the surface again. So, for instance, the head of the Croatian state is, of course, has been in prison. The communists imprisoned him for years, and in a certain sense, of course, that is his perspective now. That's understandable. And of course, he is a devoted nationalist who goes back into Croatian history. He has designed old uniforms for his soldiers, uniforms from the 19th century. So there is a lot of history behind all of this, and a lot of pain and suffering and mutual resentment.
It sounds like there's a great deal of bitterness between the Croatians and the Serbians, which doesn't seem to be easily healed. Do you think that it's going to be healed, or what's going to happen here?
Let me tell you a story, because then it gets clear, I think. In our course in Yugoslavia in April of this year in Dubrovnik, a Serbian woman wanted to speak in the course. And usually all the Yugoslavs who were there were Russians there and everybody, but the Yugoslavs are mostly Croats, were mostly Croats. So this Serbian woman wanted to speak. They didn't want her to speak. I said, we are an international course. Everybody can speak. So finally we let her speak. But then she wanted to do more than speak. She wanted to somehow to make an appeal for 30 Serbs who had been taken prisoners by the Croats, and she wanted to somehow to make an appeal to the government in Zagreb that they should be set free. Right away, the Croats, of course, said all these Serbs are terrorists, and and she begged us that we should do something, and I explained to her that we were an international group and that this was a legitimate government with a legitimate administration of justice and legitimate police and so on and so on. Then she came back again at night and she begged again, and finally she started weeping, and it was not made up, it was really genuine. And she said, you are guests coming in, you see us suffer, and then you leave again and leave us in our pain and so on. You want to be Christians and you don't do anything, you are humanists and you don't do anything to us and so on. As she went on to talk about this, I thought about the whole conflict, and I remembered, of course, that the Croats made the last attempt of forced conversion in the 40s, whereby Serbian children were killed in order to force them into Catholicism. Then
as late as the 1940s.
1940s, yes. And the Archbishop of Zagreb did not oppose it. He just kept quiet and so on. Then, of course, the Croats were allied with Hitler, of course. In Hitler's documents, people found recently that he wrote down that the Archbishop of Zagreb is the pillar of National Socialism or fascism on the Balkan and so on. Then the Croats built two concentration camps around Zagreb, of course for Jews, but also for a lot of Serbs. Serbs were sent to Germany for forced labor and so on. So this is where the bitterness comes from. And I thought, you know, how can I impose on this woman now that she should be obedient to this type, to a Croat government now? And so I signed the petition.
So it's deep-seated, and there's it's ongoing, and it's not too likely. I guess what a lot of people wonder is if Yugoslavia and the ethnic violence that has happened there isn't sort of symptomatic of what is going to happen throughout Eastern Europe and Russia.
Yeah, and of course it has something to do, you know, with of course, nationalism, but also with capitalism. In the same course, before that happened with the Serbian woman, a young Croat scholar whom I know since all these years, I saw him growing up, so to speak, and he was a committed communist all these years, and a youth leader of the communist youth group, and so on and so on. But in recent years, he converted, particularly under the influence of West Germany. He went to the Goethe Institute, learned German, and so on, and also got the whole neoconservative type of philosophy. And so he appeared this time, and suddenly we found out he had turned around and now attacked his old Marxist teachers in Zagreb, particularly Petrovic, and so on. He really engaged in patricide, in a certain sense, in the Freudian sense. And he attacked particularly Glebe Möller, a very famous a scholar from Denmark, and it became so bad that I had to do what I seldom do, namely to put somebody on his place, and so I did. But he, for instance, told us a whole philosophy, namely that man is evil by nature, and capitalism appeals to that greed and to that selfishness in people. And that what is lowest in man, that is also the strongest. Therefore, capitalism is so effective. On the other hand, religion, like Orthodoxy, Catholicism, and socialism, and communism, and so on, they all appeal to high ethical ideals, and so on. But the highest in man is also the weakest, and therefore they never succeed. Now Croatia, for once, wants to succeed, and therefore they are now for capitalism. The strange thing is, of course, I mean, world religions have also said this sometimes, that man is evil by nature, but they have always shown ways of salvation in a certain sense, ways of redemption. No, not with him. Man is evil by nature, and the capitalistic system appeals to this selfishness and this greed, and therefore it is the best thing. Somehow he made a deal with the devil, And I think that this is a strong factor in the whole Croatian nationalist movement, in spite of the fact that it is, wherever it happens, this nationalism now, because it seems that the whole Kabbalistic philosophy, you know, me and greed and all this, that this does not only affect individuals, but also ethnic groups. Now they say we Croats, or we Slovenians, or we people, and so on and so on. And so, therefore, I think that this will happen all through, or is happening already, that not only the individual now says me, 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 but that also the ethnic groups say the same thing. And when 2 or 3 ethnic groups in the same unit suddenly say that, then you have this conflict. You have this civil war which you have there now.
So it's, in the short run, it's not very promising.
Well, you see, the funny thing is that this type of nationalism is not even agreeable to the Kabbalistic movement, because Western Europe, you see, is now integrating in order to make space for the multinational corporations and so on. If I once celebrated my birthday by driving from Strasbourg to Louvain and so on, and I had to change the money 3 or 4 times in order to pay my meal and so on, this is not a good Kabbalistic device. So therefore, while the rest of the world integrates in order to make space for the multinational corporations and so on, there everything falls apart. And I don't think that this you know, is very favorable to a Kabbalistic development. Right. So there is a strange irony at work in all of this.
How about the conditions of the people? Are the conditions of the people deteriorating? It would seem to me that with so much struggle going on, there is not any kind of cooperation which is needed for society to develop.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I came recently, and I came from Hungary, and I went to Vienna, and there I was stopped because the YAT, the air company of Yugoslavia, was on strike. First the pilots were on strike, then the mechanics were on strike. I took an Austrian plane to Belgrade, then I was stopped in Belgrade. Nothing moved on this whole airport. I had to sit there a whole day long and look at these signs, and everything stood still and so on. And I had to force them to pay vouchers for hotel and for food, which they didn't want to do, and so on. Now, then finally I had to take a train. 3 or 4 days later, the American ambassador told me not to go at all because it is so dangerous now. Right. But you see, this whole atmosphere, of course, is not favorable for that what all these people lived from, namely from foreigner coming in and staying in those huge hotels and so on. So, of course, now, you know, in earlier times, in all these years, every 5 minutes, a plane landed in Dubrovnik and brought people, and they went to the hotels, and there was good business. Now, this time, you know, every 2 or 3 hours, a plane came, because yacht was not allowed to land in Zagreb, for instance, you see. And all these, of course, this produces, I mean, total bankruptcy. Many of people now, the struggle is around the Serbs who are in Croatian territory. Many of them have now fled from these areas and went to those big hotels. So these big hotels have no guests. They have only refugees who eat but don't pay. Of course, that will lead to a horrible thing. But it can be, of course, also a factor in stopping this, finally, you see. I mean, if you have nothing to eat anymore, you can't have a civil war anymore. Right. Armies march on their stomachs.
A lot of people would see what's happening in Eastern Europe now as the triumph of capitalism and the destruction of Marxism. Do you think that's an accurate picture?
Yeah, I would like to make it a little bit more concrete. So I taught in Rostock at the Baltic Sea in East Germany. It had all been communistic for 47 years or whatever. When I talked to people, I concentrated on one issue in order to make clear what happened in the past and what's happening now. And the most important issue there is what we call the surplus value. That means usually we don't call it that way. Somehow here in this country we never speak about this. But the surplus value is that what a worker produces beyond his costs. So let's see, he produces $100 on Monday and he gets $20. $80 is surplus value. So the question is now, where did all these years the surplus value go? The West Germans very often say, you East Germans, you didn't work. You were lazy bugs and so on. But they worked hard. You can see them in the trains, you know, these worked out people sitting over there who built ships and so on. So they worked hard. So they did produce surplus value. Where did it go to? To the government. What did they do with it? Well, the university was free, the books were free, everything. Medicine was free, pills were free. The train, I used a ticket, I paid $1 for traveling 3 months back and forth to my place and so on. The flats, the apartments and so on were very inexpensive. The little trappy, the Trabant, which they sold to Egypt now, did cost almost nothing and so on. So that was all subsidized, of course. And everybody, of course, had a job, and so on and so on. So now, of course, what happens now? I mean, victory of capitalism, what happens now? I mean, the same people have to produce surplus value again. And, of course, this, what is now coming, the triumph of capitalism, would not have happened if they had not made one huge mistake, I think. And the huge mistake is that they did not take enough of their surplus value and shift it back into the machines by which they build ships and so on and so on. So the machines become obsolete, the productivity went down. If you want to have such a social program where you have the universities free, the hospitals free, the pills free, and so on and so on, then you have to be tremendously productive. And so on one side, they had these huge social programs where everybody was taken care of. On the other side, they had the level of productivity went down. I think that brought about a situation in which then, capitalism looked more attractive. Now, what is that now? I mean, what will happen in Rostock now? Well, in Rostock will happen now what happened before 1945. People work hard. Their surplus value goes not to the state, but to the corporation. The corporation will take more of it and shovel it back into the machinery. The machinery will be better, people will be more productive, people will also produce more surplus value, and so on. But now the surplus value is now in the hands of private people whom nobody has voted in or whatever. They may not even want to pay a gains tax or whatever. Yeah. So they may also take the money and go to South Africa, or go to Mexico, where they find even cheaper labor than in Rostock, and so on. So it will not stay in the country at all. So this is, on one side, you could say, the defeat of real socialism, as it was called, real socialism or state socialism. And on the other side, the victory of capitalism. And the victory of capitalism comes with the tremendous sophistication of the instruments of production, tremendous communication, telephone, television, and all this, and a mass market of commodities, which of course tremendously attractive. I mean, in East Germany, most people voted for a Mercedes or so, or voted for the German mark, of course, So democracy means for them to have a Mercedes, or to have at least a better car, or their own house, and so on and so on.
Right. Okay. Well, do you think that this is a repudiation, or I would say not so much a repudiation, but sort of a disintegration of the Marxist philosophy?
Well, it depends now, whom you ask. That means there are at least 7 perspectives on this thing. So if you ask, of course, a Stalinist, you get one answer. And there are such people around, of course, everywhere. If you ask a Leninist, like Gorbachev, you get another answer, If you ask a reform communist, like Dubček in Prague, you get another perspective of it, right? So these are the, and if you ask a Praxis philosopher, like Habermas in Frankfurt, you again get another answer. These are the pro-socialistic people. Then you have the anti-socialistic people. So if you ask, for instance, the deconstructionists in France and in Germany, the critics of rationality and so on, then you get another answer. If you ask the neoconservatives, and they are particularly here, then you get an answer different. And if you get the liberals, you have another answer. So you have 7 different answers. What is really happening? And the reason for this is that the whole process is tremendously complicated and contradictory. That makes it possible that you can have 7 different positions of what in God's name is happening. And from our news, we just get the neoconservative. Yeah, very often we don't even get the liberal one.
That's true. I think the way the developments in Eastern Europe are presented in our media is that this is a justification of the capitalist position and clear proof that Marxism is a failure.
Yeah. I mean, this is the neoconservative position. And neoconservatism means that you want to continue capitalistic modernization, and not only in Europe, but into Eastern Europe. And that at the same time, you want to cancel the cultural modernization, which includes the bourgeois enlightenment, from which our constitution comes, which includes the Marxist enlightenment, which we never let come in here, and which also includes the Freudian enlightenment, which we let come in a little bit. So from this point of view, of course, it looks that way, But it depends now. There are other perspectives, and there are good reasons for other perspectives too.
Now, there are some people who would say that what was going on in Eastern Europe was not what Marx believed. Marx's ideas, like for example Michael Harrington, his position would be that what Marx talked about was political and economic democracy. And in Eastern Europe and in the Soviet Union, you had some economic democracy, but no political democracy. So therefore, that what happened, the disintegration of that kind of a system, had very little to do with what Marx was really talking about, because that wasn't true Marxism. What do you think of that?
Yeah, I mean, my friend, great friend, Walter Dirks, a great journalist in Europe and so on, if somebody would say, well, you spent your whole life now for Christianity and socialism, and what now, and so on, he would say, how can something collapse which has never existed? You know? But he would say the same thing about Christianity as well. So, and there is some truth in this. And so on. But I think it is a very differentiated type of thing. I think that Marx himself already may have made some mistakes, for instance, by emphasizing the human potential of work and tool almost as much as Jefferson or so, you know, some of our people here, thereby blended out or neglected other things. For instance, language and memory, or a struggle for recognition or so. Other human potentials were not focused on. And so a certain one-sidedness, I think, was in the picture from the beginning. Maybe you need this one-sidedness if you want to achieve something. Now, of course, his description of the bourgeoisie and its revolutionary force right in the beginning of the Communist Manifesto, of course, is quoted today because it's such a beautiful description of what is happening, really, you know. This is ironical, I would say. But then, you know, as far as Lenin is concerned, one has to ask, you know, if he is really legitimated by Marx, or to what extent what he did was legitimated. And many people would, it depends again, you know, which perspective you take. Right. But the Praxis philosopher, for instance, would say that Lenin's revolution was not really legitimated by the Marxian teaching. I mean, Marx never thought that socialism should start in Russia, one of the bourgeois-wise most backward areas and so on. So, and then, I mean, everybody is in agreement, I think, except a few Stalinists, that Stalin was a horrible deviation, you know, as much as the Inquisition is a deviation from the teaching of Jesus, so was, you know, Stalin a deviation and so on. And now, to what extent now, you know, Gorbachev and Perestroika and Glasnost is obviously an attempt, you know, to recover some of the genuine elements in Lenin, the late Lenin, that means the Lenin after the revolution, after the 12 capitalistic countries had intervened, and after he had overcome this intervention, after he had been assassinated by a coed, a medical student far to the left of him, and was ill because of this. At that time, he developed this idea of peaceful coexistence and so on, and of course Gorbachev took that up again, but under a completely different perspective now. At that time it was one country, one socialistic country among all these capitalistic countries. This time I think behind the Gorbachev idea is that if one wants to reach alternative future number 3, let's call it that way, the realm of freedom beyond the realm of necessity, which Marx had in mind, if one wants to reach that, and on the way one gets into such a situation where you have two blocks which can annihilate each other in 25 minutes, then this has to be stopped. Because with this type of a procedure and a methodology, where you will get to is alternative future number 2. That means global Hiroshima, without capitalism to be sure, but without socialism as well, and no realm of freedom whatsoever. I think that this is the deepest ethical motivation behind Perestroika, which is started out as a revolution from above and elicited a revolution from below, which I think got out of hand in a certain sense because of the nationalistic movements. I'm not entirely sure if the establishment, the Russian establishment, when they started Perestroika, were really aware, you know, of the power of this nationalistic potential from Lithuania to the Ukraine, to Yugoslavia, to Hungary and everywhere.
So that's a real sticking point, is that ethnic. It's interesting to me, in South Africa with the developments, they talk a lot about black on black violence, but you don't hear the term white on white violence, and I guess there's a lot of same principles there.
You know, I would say now, in this whole chaos, I mean, the President Bush has, of course, a neoconservative position,
Right.
but there is great wisdom in it, in a certain sense, that he is afraid, for instance, of anarchy. You know, for a bourgeois like he is, anarchy is, of course, worse than Stalinism. That is, that's something, there's no leadership, you don't know with whom to talk and all this. And then, of course, I think that President Bush is also frightened from the other side, nationalism and fascism and so on. Yeah. I mean, 15 Russian republics, each of them having the atomic bomb and each of them being nationalistic, you know, is a nightmare which is as great as anarchism, but 100 times greater than Stalinism or whatever we had. So one has to see that out of this whole thing, nothing worse comes out. And I think the American government, in its support for Gorbachev, has really follows at this time a wise course. Yeltsin, you see, made a great mistake in the first session after the coup d'etat, you know, where he said, and now with one stroke of the feather, or an edict, I will outlaw the Communist Party. That's what every fascist state does on the first day, to outlaw the Communist Party, and that outlawing is then called democracy.
And done in the name of the people.
But I was amazed, you know, that our foreign policy caught that right at the moment and shifted, you know, after 2 or 3 days, to support Gorbachev, in the hope, you know, that a central government can be established, which has a monopoly in terms of force and atomic bombs and so on, and Gorbachev will preside, or somebody else will preside over it.
How would you define socialism? Were these socialist countries? What does socialism mean?
Well, if one takes all human potentials into consideration, and not only now production and distribution and so on, I would dare to define it, you know, in terms of a non-violent communication. Obviously, also communism has something to do with communication. A non-violent intersubjectivity, an undamaged intersubjectivity, characterized by the attempt of mutual understanding and mutual recognition. See, the recognition which we have in capitalistic countries is, of course, an asymmetrical one. The workers recognize Ford, but for Ford, the workers are means of production who have to produce a surplus value. That is not symmetrical recognition. We could also say socialism aims at mutual recognition, it aims at universal solidarity, it aims at the end of any form of master-servant relationship. There should not be somebody who appropriates from the collective the surplus value without having worked.
Yeah, I see.
And so therefore, socialism, whatever it may be, as an economic theory, whatever, it has a normative core. And this normative core means intersubjectivity without force, without violence. And if you see this definition, then you see also the horrible deviation which has taken place in Eastern Europe. And you understand why my friend Walter Dirks will say, how can something break down which has never existed?
I see what you're saying. Well, what about the transition now? Certainly there is movement here. These countries are moving in a new direction now. And how hard is this on the people? Is it very hard on the people? Or at least before, there were some programs in place to make sure that people had their basic needs met. Is that the case now?
Yeah. Well, I mean, let me take Rostock, right? East Germany, this is one case. I mean, it's different in Yugoslavia, different in Hungary, different in Poland. And
so different countries are meeting this in different ways.
But let's take the most favorable place would be East Germany now, you know, because West Germany, very rich country, very successful in terms of democracy and successful economically too. And they are now integrated, so there it should work best. I mean, if it doesn't work there fast, you know, it cannot work anywhere, right. You know, the new transformation and so on. Now, in Rostock itself, it has 40% unemployment. During summer, it went up to 50% unemployment. The harbor, it has a huge harbor, which was the only real harbor of East Germany as a state. There, everything's empty. 2 years ago, 1.5 years ago, the ships were coming in and out, everything empty, everything stands still, and so on. I drove on a train every day, and one day I sat in a new car, 2 new cars practically had been put together, they were $4 million. Suddenly, it started burning. I was sitting in the middle of it, and the flames came all over. So I jumped out of it, and I took a picture of it. So people had had put fire on it. The locomotive engineer died in the process, and so on, out of anger against that what was happening to them. No work and all these support things, which I mentioned before. I was sitting in a streetcar once, and they shouted and screamed at me because I thought I was from West Germany, and so on. So I had to leave the streetcar. And so now, I think what is behind this is, no matter how bad a socialism that was, they did try something, you see. And one thing which they tried was to realize the material human rights. We emphasize the formal human rights, and that means the right to speak, the right to go to church, and so on and so on. But the material human rights we have never formulated. That is the right to work, the right to housing, the right to clothing, to medical health, and so on. We have 30 million people who have no health insurance, and so on. So that is what they introduced. Now you can say, of course, the medical stuff wasn't very good, but everybody was taken care of. Nobody would go to a hospital and would ask, do you have money or whatever? And if you don't have any, you have to go somewhere else, you see. Right. So and now, of course, what the West does, Cole and so on, is emphasizing these formal human rights. They have the right to speak, the right to go to church, and so on. And I think they're very grateful for it. But what they don't want is to lose the material rights, you see. Right. That is the issue. And of course, why we have formulated the formal rights and not the material right is because the formal rights don't cost anything, and the material rights are expensive. You have to take it from the surplus value.
I see what you're saying.
Yeah.
So are you hopeful? Do you think things are going to move in a good direction, or you think that there's a setback here and it's going to be tough, very tough going for these people for a while?
Well, I mean, see, it has to be answered in a differentiated way. Kalamazoo is split into the north side and the other side, into winners and losers, right? Capitalism means, as President Bush says all the time, the winners and the losers. And somehow that must be that way. I don't know why that must be that way, but he thinks it's necessary. So while these societies, besides having certain material rights and so on, they also tried, of course, to bring more equality among people, right? So the bourgeoisie, the French Revolution, American Revolution, English Revolution, and so on, promised, of course, freedom, brotherhood, and equality, and so on. But you know that we don't have much equality, and we don't have much brotherhood neither. I mean, Philadelphia is the only city, which bombed its own citizens, and so on.
Yes, that's right.
City of brotherly love, and so on. So we have freedom, which is the freedom, of the corporations to go all around the globe and make as much surplus value as possible, and so on. So now, of course, that is why the Marxist movement started in the first place, because the bourgeoisie had betrayed its own promises, and so on. So, but, you see, from the very beginning, it was very difficult to get those three things together. That means to have freedom and equality at the same time, because if you allow freedom, then, of course, the stronger guy will run faster, and the little guy will be left behind. And then you have freedom, but you don't have any equality. Right. If you enforce equality, then you have to restrain the freedom of the strong guy. Now, there were very wise bourgeois who thought if they could maybe mediate freedom and equality through brotherhood. That means the strong guy who has all the freedom now would, out of brotherly love, allow the weaker guy to have a chance too. And then, you see, one would have both somehow somewhat limited freedom, but also a certain amount of equality. But that way it didn't work. And while we have freedom without equality and brotherhood, they try to have equality and, of course, not much freedom. That means no freedom at all in our sense. That means you could not make money from somebody else's work, which is the core, capitalistic core freedom. So now they have, by sacrificing that freedom, they have established a certain equality. Now what will happen in the society is that this equality disappears from day to day. I mean, you see right away, not only now the trapeze, everybody has a trappee, but suddenly somebody comes with a Mercedes and the other one still has a trappee, And so you see step by step that the unbrotherliness and inequality comes in, and the whole society splits in winners and losers. So when you ask, will it be good or bad, it depends if you are among the winners or the losers. And so I gave a talk, to the medical faculty at the university. Of course, they will be among the winners,
Yeah.
As soon as socialist medicine ends, they can become millionaires in 5 years,
Right.
So but they have nothing to complain, But it depends now, these workers up there in the harbor, who will produce the surplus value. They may very well be on the same level where they were before, while the others go up in the world.
One of the things that I've heard a lot about is environmental damage, that in their efforts to provide for their people, they weren't careful about the environment, and that this did tremendous harm, and that now this has to be cleaned up, and that's going to be another drain on the economy. Was that your experience? Did you see remnants of that, or?
I mean, first of all, one has to see that one doesn't involve oneself in a contradiction. Because if one says, you know, they have not industrialized or they were not successful in industrialization, if they hadn't done that, they wouldn't have any environmental problem. So if we say they have an environmental problem, then we admit at the same time that they did industrialization but didn't take care of the environment. And that is what happened, I think. So when you go, when I drove into Thuringia in last year already and sometime before this, you see huge clouds, you know, of this, what is called brown coal. It's not coal which is dug out of the depth there, but which you get from the surface. It's a certain type of coal.
Strip mine.
Yeah, strip mine, which East Germany has a lot, and so on. So this dust stuff was laying all over the place. I don't think it does much to your lungs, but it smells and it's not comfortable and so on. So this is obviously an environmental damage. And then around the industrial centers, I mean, East Germany became from a totally agricultural area, it moved itself up under socialism to the 16th industrial nation. And I think that they, you know, put so much, they had preferred status in the East Bloc, so they got all kinds of material and so on in order to build them up that way. And I think in that process they have sinned, you know, against the environment, like we do. If you go to Gary, Indiana, you know, you have a moon landscape. I never saw a moon landscape of that kind, like in Gary, Indiana, and so on. But I saw some damage, yes, definitely.
Okay. What about the church? Now, you were over there conducting institutes and giving classes very much centered around religion. What part has religion played in bringing the people to where they are now, and what part can it play in the future of these countries?
Yeah, well, let me tell you about my friend Wilhelm Fritzsche, who is the dean of the theological faculty. I just got news, you know, that he has been thrown out of his office and so on. He is now unemployed. The reason for that was that he was a man who entered the Marxist Christian dialogue. So therefore he was a Christian, Protestant, theologian, dogmatic professor, and he entered, you know, with the different Marxist philosophers, the ML people, Marxism-Leninism people, discourses, and so he was allowed to travel, and whenever he traveled, he had to make a report with 4 copies, and 1 copy always went to the Stasi. Now they opened up the Stasi documentary thing there in Rostock, and there they find his reports. He was here in this country at least 10 times, and every time he wrote a Stasi report, you see. Now these were the cooperators, you see. They were Christians who cooperated with socialism, and others, you know, who resisted it and took some kind of a bunker position, you know, and waited for the moment when it would collapse. Now they are now, of course, triumphant and think that all their prayers have finally done it, and that God has fulfilled their prayers and, you know, got rid of these atheistic Bolshevists and so on. So they're very happy about it, yeah.
But do you think that did religion? I know, like for example, in Czechoslovakia or in East Germany too.
Yeah.
It seemed like the churches played a large part in mobilizing people. At least it was a refuge where people could come together to discuss what was going on.
Yeah, I studied this a little bit in East Berlin, because that is where it took place before the wall opened. Yeah, these were Protestants more than Catholics who got together in the churches. But you see, what they wanted was another socialism. They didn't want to have that state socialism, but a little bit more what I somehow defined before, namely, you know, non-violent intersubjectivity, undamaged intersubjectivity, mutual understanding, mutual recognition, absence of master-servant relationship, and so on. And they based that in the gospel. They based that in their faith position and faith community in the Sermon on the Mount, and rightly so, you see. But when then the vote came, they lost it all. I think they didn't even get 5% or what, you know. The majority voted for the German mark. They voted for the Mercedes, and they lost out.
So do you think that the people are under some kind of an illusion? I mean, do you think that they're realistic in their expectations? A lot of them are expecting that capitalism is going to be the key, which is going to move them to a new, very high standard of living. you think that's realistic?
That was 2 years ago, you see. But then, I mean, as jubilant as it all was, I mean, people were really moved, you know, when the wall opened and when the wire was removed and so on and so on. So it was but as fast as it came, so fast it disappeared as soon as they saw what the real consequence is. I have still, you know, in the name of those people, will write to Chancellor Kohl, because on one level, you see, never have the American armed forces degraded or dishonored the people in West Germany as the West Germans are dealing now or dishonoring their brothers in East Germany. You see, about you were lazy and you know, you haven't done anything since the Second World War. We had to start out with nothing. You have to start out with nothing, as if they had done nothing whatsoever. And so on. So this, you know, is one factor why things got less enthusiastic than they were. And then, of course, you know, the removal of the material rights is painful. I mean, that goes into your pension, you know. I mean, there's a widow who worked and on top of it still had a pension. This pension has now been removed. Suddenly she is with 800 marks or 1,000 marks less than before, and so on. Then, like the old currency reform in 1948 in West Germany, you see, so in this one now restores somehow again the class system. Among, you know, the old bourgeois class system. And what makes people most mad is that sometimes the former communist functionaries in collective enterprises now suddenly are also at the front in the recapitalization process, and so on. So that produces bitterness and so on. So, I mean, there are people in East Germany who want to have the wall back. And there are also people in West Germany who want to have the wall back and vote very much for socialism because they think that the Chancellor Kohl, you know, lied to them when he said this reunion could take place without any taxes or what in West Germany. So suddenly they found out that they must pay tremendous amount of taxes in order to build the infrastructure in East Germany so that then the multinational corporations can move in. Because they cannot move in if they don't have enough telephones and when the rails are not straight and so on and so on. So this is a lot of money, and it means that the West German living standard has to go down somewhat. I don't think too much, but has to go to somewhat in order to produce a Marshall Plan for East Germany, and not to speak of a Marshall Plan for Poland or a Marshall Plan for Russia, which Kohl is very eager for, because he knows when he pays the Russians billions now, the Russians will also take the German corporations first before they take the American corporations. See, whoever pays more, even the seven have noticed now, whoever pays Russia more now, they are, of course, the people whose corporations will also go in first and will be accepted and so on and so on.
They'll get most favored
nothing for
treatment.
charity, I mean. You know.
Most favored treatment in trade, huh?
Yeah, that's right.
Well, it would seem to me that this has enormous implications for the whole world. Just one element is in terms of military. I mean, the United States last year spending about $1 billion a day on the military, and about half of that went to the defense of Western Europe. It seems like that's not necessary anymore. If it was ever necessary in the beginning, it certainly doesn't seem necessary now. So won't there be a tremendous freeing of money, of capital, that was used for military?
Yeah. One should think so, you know, but what I called before the future number 2, you know, that's the NBC wars and so on. I mean, Russia is still the country which can annihilate us in 25 minutes, you see. And so no matter if it remains united or if it becomes 15 republics or so, I mean, just look at the map, you know. It is a huge territory, and even if Yeltsin is right, and they put all atomic weapons now into Russian territory, you know, in the Russian Republic and so on, I mean, it will still be a tremendous fireball, you know, tremendous. I mean, we have U-boats still laying along the east coast, you know. Each of these U-boats, each of them has 4 times the firepower of all the bombs and grenades which were fired in the Second World War. Each of them, you see. So I think that perestroika has reduced, you know, the probability and the possibility of alternative future number 2 by maybe maximally 5%, 4%.
Only 5
more.
to 4%?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, this is beautiful. I mean, we should be grateful for it, you know. But we should not think, you know, that now everything has been settled. It depends all what becomes of Russia now. If it follows perestroika, you know, then it will go down further. I mean, we will have 10, 20% less possibility, you know, of alternative future number 2. But if it gets in the hands of a Yeltsin, of a nationalist or a fascist, or back to the Stalinists or whatever, I mean, people are aware, you know, in Moscow that the coup d'etat may not have been the last one. Because you have to think, you know, that there are people who have for 17 years, they have been trained in a certain philosophy. See, no American thinks of the surplus value. In 25 years, I have seen one movie in which the word surplus value came. But everybody thinks about surplus value in socialistic countries, you see, because that's what the whole struggle was about. So therefore, they will ask those questions. And if the economic situation does not change very soon to the better, there is the danger, you know, that there will be another coup d'etat. That means from the, we say always from the right, but you could say that it's from the far left rather, you know, in the general. That means from the communist side, from the Leninist side, or from the Stalinist side.
Yeah, yeah.
As it was, you know, a few weeks ago.
Sure. I've been reading lately, I know you didn't go to the Soviet Union in this trip,
no.
But I've been reading about winter in the Soviet Union and the tremendous fear, because the winters are so fierce there, the fear of starvation, the fear of how are people going to be able to keep warm, how is the society going to be continuing? How about the rest of Eastern Europe? I mean, they don't have this winters as severe as the Soviet Union, I would imagine. But isn't this winter a crucial time? I mean, before the supports were there, so that while people did not achieve a tremendously high standard of living, at least there was the supports. Those supports are probably not going to be there this winter.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, this is one of those dangerous spots, you know. I mean, there are Russians who said it was so much better under Stalin, you know. I mean, at least we had our food and so on, you know. And that would be then the basis, depending how large it is, for a new coup d'etat and so on. And we should, of course, under all circumstances, prevent this. And this is behind our help, which we want to give. You know, we know this. But on the other hand, you know, I, as an ex-German who was trained to march into Russia, you know, Russia is a huge territory with unbelievable resources, and one does not really know how they could ever have messed them up the way they have messed them up. But you see, in these terrible winters, let's see, for 42, 43, and so on, you know, with German invasion into the suburbs of Moscow, they did not starve to death. I mean, they did starve to death in what is now called Petrograd again, in the former Leningrad. There was starvation because it was encircled, but even there they were able, you know, still to help themselves. So it is a tremendously strong and powerful Slavic nation, which we should never underestimate. It was the fate of Hitler that he underestimated their stamina and what they can do. So while I think that it could be severe, I don't think they will starve to death. But they will certainly need help, you see, if the so-called democratization process should go on, and if there should not be another coup, maybe a more successful one, and that wouldn't be good for them, not good for us.
What do you think we could learn from all this? I mean, all these changes, all the turmoil, all the hopes. What is there for the American people to learn?
Do you want to be honest? Do you want me to be honest?
Please be honest, brutally honest.
Well, I think most desirable would be if we had our own perestroika and our own glasnost, you see, in the concrete sense that it is beautiful that we have our formal rights, and I'm daily grateful for them, particularly, you know, when I had my own contacts with the FBI and so on, I was grateful for all these formal rights. But I think it would be good to have material rights as well. I think it would be nice to introduce bills and so on, by which we would accept, since particularly we have a Supreme Court judge now who is firm in the natural law and so on, so we could introduce now all kinds of laws by which we would establish the right to housing, the right to work, the right to clothing, the right to food. 10 million people are starving to death in this country. 38 million people are in the slums. 38 million people, 32 million people, 38 million people have no health insurance. There is a lot of work to be done, right? So, and then also as far as our ideals of our Constitution and the Declaration of Independence and so on, a little bit more equality would be nice, you know, a little bit more brotherhood would be nice. So, even if it would mean a certain limitation to the freedoms of the corporation to appropriate surplus value from other people's work.
So you see the United States needing a perestroika and a glasnost right
I
here.
think so, yeah. We will call it differently, but I think it would be very beautiful if we could have something like this.
What do you think you're going to see when you go back next year? You'll be going
Yeah, I
back
go
next
back
summer,
to
I would
Yugoslavia,
estimate.
yeah, right, yeah.
What will happen? What do you think you expect to see? What do you expect
I
to see?
think that the pressures of the European community, you know, saying we will only take all of Yugoslavia or nothing into our community and so on, may tame down the Croats to some extent. And that simply, you know, the Croatian coast, you know, is that where all the foreigners went, and so that they will say, you know, this is really bad for business. I mean, if they are really serious about being capitalistically minded, you know, then they will have to draw this conclusion, you know, that they will ruin the country, you know, beyond recognition if they will not stop that soon and establish a certain security and trust so that corporations will go in whatsoever. Nobody will go in, not even guests, not to speak of corporations in this destabilized situation. So I hope that this, you know, I don't think that ethics will or that religion will bring them to their senses, unfortunately not. But I think that these economic pressures, at least, will at a certain point bring them to their senses, except if they are completely suicidal. So I think that by that time, now there is an armistice at the moment, you know, because the Croats have withdrawn their forces from the camps of the Federal Army. And so at the moment, things are holding, if they will hold forever. I get letters from Croats, you know, who want to have a humanistic Croatia. My beautiful friend Ivan Supek, the former president of the University of Zagreb, we just embraced each other recently. Again, a beautiful humanistic person. He thinks really there can be a humanistic Croatia. See, there's one side. And on the other side, I will bring from Osijek a family there who are so terribly afraid that their children, they would be murdered. So they have fled to Austria, and I hope I can bring them here. We are just, you know, still talking with Washington and so on, because they have not been, you know, it has not been recognized by us that these people can have refugee status or can be political refugees or whatever. So it's difficult. But I think that a certain stabilization will set in, and if it was only because of these economic considerations.
So you see that
Not
things
because
will
they love
calm
each other.
down
Huh?
for just for self-interest.
Yeah,
they'll
not
put
because
aside
they love each other or
not
because they are
love each
overcome by the Holy Spirit, which would be very desirable, but simply because of these external, mechanical, economic pressures.
Do you think it's a good thing if the corporations go in there? You're saying that the corporations won't go in if there is all this turmoil and uncertainty.
Well,
do you think it's a good thing if they go in?
I mean, there are good sides to it, you know. If you see the horrible slobbiness, you know, over there. I mean, that you stand in an airport, you know, and you have to wait for hours, you know, because somebody talks to his lover somewhere on the telephone, you know, or goes to the toilet and doesn't come back anymore. I mean, capitalism, you know, puts people to their task. It disciplines them.
Efficiency.
I don't like the cruelty with which this may be done, but I mean, if capitalism moves in further, there will be disciplining, you know. See, nobody could be fired there. I wish that people would work without the fear of being fired. But if they cannot come up to this human level, then they need the same external pressure. You will be fired if you don't function. It's horrible. Or let me put it that way. If our workers, when I go to our workers, I would say we need a little bit more communicative rationality. Can't you stop working and talk with your neighbor a little bit, you know, and drink some coffee and talk about last Sunday and so on. Now, to a Yugoslav worker or East German worker, even not so much, but Czechoslovakian, Polish, particularly Polish worker, you know, I would say, couldn't you stop drinking coffee for once, you know, and go to your instrument and do some work, you see? I mean, that is the good side. I mean, the bourgeoisie overthrowing, you know, the whole feudal conditions and the traditional conditions meant, of course, progress, without doubt. Marx has never denied that. Engels was himself a capitalist, never denied that. No reasonable man can deny this, you know. The problem why people want to go beyond capitalism, that is another one, you know. That has something to do with material rights, you know. That has something to do with equality and so on. See, that's another story. But when you ask me about the transition, you know, from traditional to capitalistic conditions, I would opt for capitalism, yes. If you ask me the transition from capitalism to a more humane society, I would opt for this more humane society.
So do you see then, some people talk in terms of a third way. not a pure Marxism, not a pure capitalism, something that combines the best of each? Is that what you would say?
Yeah, it is probably a beautiful idea, but it hasn't worked so far.
It hasn't worked so far.
Yeah. I mean, what Gorbachev has in mind, I think, and I mentioned the Bush administration, it's a good thing that they support him, and I hope they will continue this, Of course, the whole vocabulary which he uses is not ours. When he talks about markets, he doesn't mean our market. He doesn't mean the stock market and so on. He means a socialistic market. Now, if this is something like a third way, it's another question. I doubt it somehow. The socialistic market means that you have still people's owned corporations, because he thinks that socialism is ethically superior to capitalism. And he is hellishly afraid that if you let private people appropriate other people's labor value and so on, that you have a selfish and greedy type of a thing. He would also point out, that we do not let the market go its way all the time. There is government intervention for the saving and loan corporations which got bankrupt, We have to pay unemployment compensation. These are all interventions into the market. We do not let the market, operate by itself. There are 10 million people starving to death because the market does not reach them. And if the government doesn't feed them, the market will not feed them. And so he knows all this. So he doesn't want our market society. He wants to have a socialistic market society in which the corporations are more accountable to themselves. And where when they get bankrupt, where not, as it has been, where the government comes in and supports them and keeps them alive and so on, but they can go under. You see, but they will be people-owned. They will not be privately owned. And the same way, let's see, they will have a lease system in terms of agriculture. They will lease land, let's see, for 50 years or for 99 years or so. But they want to make sure that there is a balance between the particular and the universal, between the individual and the community. They don't want to have absolute property, you see, where in the hands of people who have not been voted in, you see. Capitalism is not democratic, it's oligarchical. Who have not been voted in, nevertheless make tremendous decisions which affect the lives of millions of people and so on.
We only have about a minute and a half left, Dr. Siebert, and I know that one of the things that has distinguished you is that you're a theologian of hope. Are you hopeful now? Do you see the developments as a sign of hope? We have about a minute left for your answer. Answer.
I was very hopeful in Rostock in all my talks and wherever I go and so on. Because I think that, let's say the multinational corporations move in and so on. There is still now the possibility, even in terms of formal democracy, that people can vote out the Christian Democratic Party if it lies, or if it is too selfish, or if it is just for the rich, and so on and so on. There are still a lot of socialistic parties there. There are communistic parties there, and so on. So people, if they want to, they can take the West seriously and can say, you told us about the pluralistic type of political system. Please, let's use it now, right? So, and not having, like in East Germany, again, a block vote, where all parties are under pressure of one and so on and so on. Yeah. But where now, like in West Germany, people are voting now in different states for the Social Democrats and so on, because Kohl lied to them, you see. And that is what they can do now. And there is hope in this democratic will formation. So I would say there is hope in what I call a constitutional patriotism. Not a patriotism which the Germans were used to, a patriotism of blood and soil, but a constitutional patriotism, you see, where one is a patriot because one's country has a good constitution. And that one holds on to this. And that is the Gorbachev line. And I think that's a line which is acceptable to us.
Okay, Dr. Siebert, there's a lot more that we would like to talk about, but we're out of time right now. Thanks very much. You gave us some wonderful insights into what is going on right now. Thank you very much for watching.
Welcome.